Well, where has this led us? What has happened is that we began with this basic philosophy that there was no God, that man was a product of evolution. There was no supernatural. There was no God. Man was a product of evolution, an accident. Coming out of the 19th century, this was the prominent philosophy, evolutionary humanism. Man was supreme. Man could evolve to become God himself. It was Ludwig Feuerbach, the post-Hegelian philosopher, who put it this way. He said, Christians are the true atheists because they deny the deity which is themselves. And for many people in the 19th century, they felt that they could become God themselves through evolution. And we talked about even the Mormons the other night, how Joseph Smith took this philosophy and simply coded it with Christian terminology and pawned it off as a new revelation, saying that man could evolve to become gods themselves. This was the basic philosophy. When man had said there is no supernatural, there is no God, man was evolving, man could be God himself. And in the 19th century, optimistic humanism ran wild. Man believed that he could build a utopia apart from God, that man was the answer to life's problems. But this optimistic humanism was quickly shattered coming into the 20th century by 2 world wars and a depression. And this utopia that man felt that he could build apart from God, this utopia was shattered by these 2 world wars and a worldwide depression. And in the middle of the 20th century, in the early 1950s, arising out of the ashes of the world wars, there came a philosophy known as existentialism. Now that's a fancy term. It simply deals with the meaning of existence. Men trying to explain what is the meaning of life. If we have said there is no God, and man is simply an accident of evolution, then what is the meaning and purpose of life? And so men tried to explain that through a philosophy known as existentialism. Men like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Heidegger, Jaspers, and others. Jean-Paul Sartre, who died last year in Paris, France, understood the dilemma well. He made this statement. He said, a finite point without an infinite reference point becomes meaningless and absurd. What he was saying was this. A finite point man. If there is no infinite reference point in God, he said ultimately man becomes meaningless and absurd. That there is no meaning to life. Life is absurdity. So you saw arising in the 1950s this philosophy known as the philosophy of the absurd. Just read Albert Camus' books. You had also developing at that time such things as the theater of the absurd, music of the absurd. Life was absurd. There was no meaning to anything. Man was alone in the universe. I read a recent article in the International Literary Quarterly about this, and they put it this way. They said, quote, today we take it for granted that we live in a world without coherence and without certainty. In coming to terms with it, the absurd has ceased to be absurd at all and has become the climate of our everyday life. And they said for many people, life has become absurd. That's what life is about. I'll never forget, I was going to the University of California, and John Cage, the musician of the absurd, back in the 60s, came to do a musical in Golden Gate Park. Some of you may remember this. And John Cage took a Steinway grand piano. He put it out in Golden Gate Park there in San Francisco. He had microphones in this grand piano leading out the big amplifiers and speakers. And then he threw kerosene and gasoline on this grand piano, $10,000 Steinway grand piano, and he lit it on fire. And as the thing went up in flames, the breaking of the strings, the crackling of the wood was magnified out through the amplifiers and speakers as his music. And I'll never forget people standing around that day going, hey, that's absurd! And John Cage looked at him and he said, you got the point. Life is absurd. There's no meaning to anything. Man is alone in the universe. But you see, man could not live with his absurdity. And so in 1957, a man died in Hollywood named Aldous Huxley. He died on mescaline. And his devotee, Timothy Leary, and Richard Allport, professors at Harvard, began to proclaim a new philosophy in the early 60s. And turn on, drop out. Take a little acid, a little LSD, a little mescaline, smoke some dope, and perhaps you can find meaning and purpose in yourself. If there is no meaning in the universe, maybe the meaning and purpose is inside of ourselves. And drugs is going to be the way that we're going to expand our inner consciousness. We're going to find meaning in ourselves. Well, I don't have to tell you where that led to. The destruction of people's minds and bodies through the taking of drugs, and it continues to this day. And people did not find in the early 60s that meaning and purpose to life they were looking for. They were empty people trying to find it. And they could not find it in themselves, so in the mid-1960s, something began to happen in our society. There arose a whole new movement called the hippie generation, the flower children. And there was a mass movement to a place called Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. Young people said, we're going to find meaning and purpose. If we cannot find it in ourselves, then we'll find it in other people, and we will build a utopia and have peace on earth. And so they went to Haight-Ashbury to build a utopia and find peace and meaning in each other. I was down in San Francisco a couple months ago, and I drove past Haight-Ashbury. The park is empty. It's just a signpost today. It says Haight and Ashbury. The park was empty. What happened? The problem is everybody went there looking for the same thing. They were all looking for love and meaning. The problem was there was nobody there to give it. They were all empty people looking for the same thing. So what happened at the end of the 1960s was man said, if I cannot find meaning in myself, and if I cannot find it in other people, because instead of loving each other, they began to rip each other off with bad dope, and it became a very ugly scene, as you remember. So coming into the 1970s, something began to happen and change in our society. People said, if I cannot find meaning on the level of humanity, maybe I need to go a step lower, below humanity, back to the level of nature. And maybe if I get back with nature, I can find meaning and purpose in nature. And so the whole world went on a big ecology kick in the early 1970s. Get back with nature, love nature, and nature will love you. I had two friends. I was going to Cal State Hayward at the time, and two friends who left and they moved up to Wairika, California to live in a teepee. And they were going to get back with nature, and nature was going to love them. And I saw them a while back, and I asked them, I said, how was it getting back with nature? I'll never forget, they looked at me and they said, well, you know, Carlson, you really get tired of eating wild berries and roots all the time. And they said, you know, we don't understand. We tried to love nature, and nature turned around and was very violent, killed 52 people in a volcano at Mount St. Helens, killed 100 people in an earthquake in Mexico City, killed 10,000 people in a typhoon in Bangladesh. They said, nature, don't you love us? And nature turned around and was very violent. And so something began to happen in the mid-1970s in our society. People said, if I cannot find meaning on the level of humanity, if I cannot find it on the level of nature, maybe I need to go a step lower, below nature, into the supernatural. But apart from God, because we had ruled God out of existence by our philosophy of naturalism. And so in the mid-70s, we saw a movement into the supernatural apart from God. And what did we see in the mid-70s? An explosion of the cults and the occult. In 1975, it was estimated there were over 2,000 Hindu gurus in the United States. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in Transcendental Meditation, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, Maharaji Ji in the Divine Light Mission, on and on. Going into the supernatural apart from God, trying to find meaning and purpose. Os Guinness who worked with Francis Schaeffer. In his book, The Dust of Death, he has a terrific statement about that period. Listen very carefully. He says, when man declares that there is no God, instead of worshiping nothing, he worships anything. And that's what began to happen in our society in the mid-1970s. We had said in our schools, there is no God. Man is an accident. But instead of worshiping nothing, man began to worship anything. As Isaiah 53:6 says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every man into his own way. Whatever seems right, whatever feels right, do it. And so we saw the cults explode upon us. We saw in 1978, Jim Jones in the People's Temple, 913 people commit mass suicide following a man who claimed to be the voice of God, the prophet of God on earth. Jim Jones had so convinced those people that he was the prophet of God that when he told them to drink poison, I mean, who are you to question the voice of God? And as I pointed out Sunday night, one of the things that was of interest in Jonestown, that when they cleaned that camp out, they did not find a single Bible in all of Jonestown. And Jim Jones had so effectively replaced the Bible with his own man-made teaching. 913 people committed suicide. Many people went from the cults, though, into another area of the occult. Seeking spiritual reality, seeking meaning and purpose in the supernatural, but apart from God, in the world of the occult. We had an explosion of movies. Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, The Omen, The Heretic, Amityville Horror, Steven Spielberg's movies, Poltergeist, movies like Ghostbusters, talking about the supernatural. Movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the spiritual force in Star Wars, the implications and religious undertones of Raiders of the Lost Ark and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. All of these things creating curiosity in people's minds about maybe there is a supernatural out there. But you see, we had defined God out of existence, so we were going into a supernatural apart from God. And what was taking place is what Paul talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 4, if you'll turn there with me, concerning the last days, which I believe we're moving into, folks. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. Paul says, but the Spirit explicitly says that in the latter times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and the doctrine of demons. Sunday night, if you watch Shirley MacLaine's movie, Out on the Limb, you are going to see the doctrines of demons and deceitful spirits. She says that she has these spirit guides who have taught her reincarnation, that there is no personal God, that you can save yourself through reincarnation and become God yourself. The doctrines of demons and deceitful spirits. In the last days, the Bible says you're going to see these things occur. Not only are you going to see the coming of false Christs and false prophets, as the ad says in USA Today this week, but in the last days, he says, you're also going to see the doctrines of demons and deceitful spirits. What do we see today in our society? I mean, you cannot even go through the checkout counter at Albertsons and Safeway here without seeing those great intellectual magazines like National Enquirer with the headlines, horoscope for 1987, demons attack house, UFOs visited planet Earth. You can't even go to the grocery store without being confronted with the occult. A recent article said that 40 million Americans, the first thing they do when they wake up in the morning is to check their horoscope to see what their zodiac sign says, whether they should get out of bed or not. It's estimated in America that close to 60 million Americans are involved in some form of the occult. Astrology, fortune-telling, use of tarot cards, palmistry, numerology. People involved in witchcraft, involved in Satanism. People involved in spiritualism, going to seances, to mediums, to clairvoyance, seeking to make contact with the dead or the spirit world, as Shirley MacLaine's talking about. Look at the most popular games. A year ago, Christmas, the number one selling game in our country was Dungeons and Dragons. D&D. A game that's being played by high school and college students around this country. Dungeons and Dragons. What is it? It's a fantasy role-playing game that allows you to live out in a fantasy world all of the immoral activity your mind can conjure up through the use of calling upon the aid of every occultic character, sorcerers, wizards, witches, demons, demagogues, to live out in a fantasy world all of the immoral behavior with the use of occultic characters. What does the Bible say about this? Because the New Age movement that we're going to see more and more coming on the media, as we're going to see Sunday night, as we've seen this week twice in the newspapers, this week the New Age, is combining as a philosophy and as a worldview for people to accept. They want you to accept the belief that there is no personal God, that you are simply part of an impersonal universe. And that as part of this universe, you have evolved from nature. And you are evolving now to become gods yourselves. And you can increase your evolution to godhood by calling upon occultic spirit guides to lead you into the occult. Eastern philosophy, Western secular humanism, and the occult. What does the Bible say about this? Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18, God speaks very clearly concerning the world of the occult that we are seeing permeating our movies, our grocery store checkout counters, games like Dungeons and Dragons. Every character in D&D is mentioned here in Deuteronomy 18. Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 to 14. Listen carefully to what God says. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, which is a very common animistic and occult ritual, including walking on hot coals, which you see much of in the New Age movement today. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire. There shall not be found among you anyone who uses divination. Divination is fortune-telling in all its forms: astrology, tarot cards, palmistry, numerology. There shall not be found among you anyone who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. And I don't know if you realize this, but this is describing 80% of the cartoons on Saturday morning programming. Sorcerers, wizards, witches, casting spells. You'd be amazed at what your children are absorbing, friends. For whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord. And because of these detestable things, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. But you shall be blameless before the Lord your God, for those nations which you shall dispossess, they listen to those who practice witchcraft and to fortune tellers. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do so. Now take, for example, astrology. It's amazing to me how many Christians I meet, and they're wearing their zodiac sign around their neck on a chain, or you walk into their home for dinner and they got a big horoscope over the fireplace. Never understanding what God says about this. That it's an abomination in His eyes. Turn, for example, to Isaiah 47. God tells us about astrologers, what He thinks of them. A multi-billion-dollar business in America today. In Isaiah 47, beginning with verse 13, listen to what God says. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let now the astrologers, those who prophesy by the stars and predict by the new moons, let them stand up and save you from what will come upon you. Behold, they have become like stubble. Fire burns them, and they cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. Friends, the answer to life, the meaning and purpose of life, is not found in the stars is not found in the sun, moon, and stars based upon the relationship of the stars and planets at the time of your birth. If that's where you're trying to find your value and meaning in life, God says it's all going to be burned up. The astrologers do not have the answer. Why? Why is it an abomination to practice the occult? If you turn to Romans chapter 1, you'll find out why. Romans chapter 1. It's very interesting, beginning with verse 18. When we talk about humanism and evolution in our society. Romans 1, beginning with verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth of God in unrighteousness. See, what we're seeing today is the literal suppression of truth. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what He has made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks. But they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, people have become fools, and have exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man. That's basic humanism, folks. We've exchanged the truth of God and are worshiping man. Basic New Age philosophy. Look at verse 25. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. See, the Bible says the lie is man has exchanged the truth of God for a lie. And what is the lie? He says they are worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. And when you practice astrology, you are following the creation, the sun, moon, and stars, rather than the Creator who made the sun, moon, and stars. When you are involved in pantheism, Eastern philosophy, nature worship of the New Age movement, you are worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. That's why God says it's an abomination. When you are involved in humanism, believing that man can be God himself, He says you've exchanged the truth of God for a lie and are worshiping the creature rather than the Creator. This is the ultimate lie. Genesis chapter 3, the serpent said to Adam and Eve, eat of the fruit. You can be God yourself. The sad thing is, the same lie that got Adam and Eve cast out of the Garden of Eden is the same lie that's going to keep many people in the New Age movement out of heaven. The New Age movement is coming to you and saying, you can be God yourself. Shirley MacLaine's going to say it Sunday night. You can be God yourself. You have the power within you. Follow the sun, moon, and stars. You will be reincarnated and evolved to become God yourself. The Bible says, professing to be wise, they have become fools and have exchanged the truth of God for a lie and are following the creation rather than the Creator. Let me conclude. Back in 1970, an event took place that shook the whole world. I'll never forget where I was. I was watching television when the news flashed across the screen. And I think it was one of those rare moments in human history when the whole world stopped and prayed. It gripped people's hearts all over the world. The news flashed across our television screens. The 3 astronauts on Apollo 13 heading towards the moon. There had been an explosion in the spaceship. And the explosion had knocked out the directional guidance system of Apollo 13. They were already 200,000 miles from Earth, heading towards the moon. When the explosion took place, it knocked out their directional guidance system, and it knocked them off course, and they were heading out into darkest oblivion. Not only did it knock out their directional guidance system, but it punctured their oxygen tanks, and they only had 2 hours of oxygen left. And I'll never forget, as we watched Houston Command Center, Johnson Space Center down in Houston, working frantically as the oxygen was seeping out of those tanks, and they were counting down from 2 hours the amount of air left for those 3 astronauts to breathe, and they were heading off course, and it appeared they were going into darkest oblivion with no hope of return. It was one of those rare moments that people all over the world identified with those 3 men, lost, heading off course with no hope. And I'll never forget Houston Space Command Center working frantically, trying to figure out, was there any possible way that those 3 astronauts could be saved? You can read about it tonight when you go home in your World Book Encyclopedia or what you have. It's incredible. With only about 10 minutes left in those oxygen tanks, heading off course in the darkest oblivion, Johnson Space Center radioed to those 3 astronauts that they have found a way that they could be saved. But there was only one possible way that they could be saved. Johnson Space Center radioed to those 3 men that they had to open the door to the lunar lander. The lunar lander that was going to be used to go to the surface of the moon. Houston Space Center said, you're going to have to go through that door and plug into its life support system and plug into its directional guidance system and use it to propel you around the moon and come back safely. It's the only possible way you can be saved. Now, you know, those 3 astronauts, having received that revelation from NASA's Command Center, you know, they had a choice. Heading off course, oxygen seeping away, having received that revelation that there was a door, there was a way, there was a new life support system, a new directional guidance system, they had a choice. You know, I can imagine the conversation going on in that spaceship. You know, one of the astronauts could have said, well, you know, what we really need to do, maybe if we just stay up here long enough, maybe through natural selection and mutation, we'll evolve some new form of oxygen tanks to adapt to outer space. You know, another one of the astronauts could have said, well, you know, maybe what we really need to do is look out our window here and check out the stars to see what our horoscope has to say about the situation. You know, another one of the astronauts could have said, well, what we really need to do is start chanting and meditating and get in tune with vibrations of the universe. Another one could have said, well, what we really need to do is be macho about this thing and pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps and be tough. Another one could have realized the situation and said, why don't we just take drugs and escape the reality of what's happening to us? You know, I ask you tonight, who among you, heading off course into an empty eternity, having received the revelation that there was a way, there was a door, there was a new life support system, there was a new directional guidance system, you could be saved?